So our first news story comes from Polygon, and the title says EA shutting down Visceral Games, overhauling Star Wars game, and they have an update. So basically, a brief rundown of what this news is whenever Disney took over Star Wars, they went to a bunch of different game developing studios, and whatever games that they had that were being worked on, like Disney Infinity, they just stopped. And they wanted to give their games to Square Enix, to EA, to whoever, not just to make a quick game that they could get out in a year or two and make quick money with. They wanted to give it to talented developers that were used to making huge blockbuster games. And so far we've gotten Star Wars Battlefront 2, and that was the big multiplayer Star Wars games. But they also had an Uncharted-like Star Wars games that they were working on, which was supposed to be a big single-player action-adventure type game, kind of like what you'd expect from Zelda, Uncharted, The Last of Us, or something like that. And it basically, because of the success of games like Destiny and Overwatch and all of these big multiplayer games that have loot boxes and ways to keep making money after the person beats the game, it was shut down to change into what a lot of people assume is going to be more of a Destiny-like game set in the Star Wars universe. It was originally supposed to be the big single-player game, like Uncharted. They hired the woman who was the main story writer or the director of the original Uncharted games. So they were basically trying to make Uncharted or Tomb Raider, but for Star Wars. And because of EA looking at it and Disney looking at it and being like, well, these other games are making a lot of money, and Uncharted, these other action-adventure games make a lot of money as well, but only for the first year that they're out. Like Overwatch, I can't really think of any other games off the top of my head, but there's like a lot of games that has these loot boxes and DLCs and stuff that you can just keep buying and buying and buying. So they've been wanting to change it to that, and they not only canceled the game, but they are putting the game under a new studio to make it more like some of these other games, and they are taking the team that was working on the game, completely getting rid of the studio and just putting certain people that was on that team, sorry, getting a little breath here, but they're taking the members that were developing the game, putting them at other studios within EA to work on other games that are already being worked on, and basically remaking the game from the ground up. So what are your guys' thoughts on this? I was going to read the article, but I already know it, so I just went off the top of my head.
Sum it up, right?
Yeah, because I thought it might be a bit quicker. So yeah, what are your thoughts on this? They're basically like making it a money grab game instead of the big game that everybody was wanting.
Well, I'll go first, I guess.
Oh no,
go
ahead,
you go
Daniel.
ahead. You're the guest. You're the guest.
Should be a little bit clear.
Have you guys played a lot of Star Wars games?
I played.
You know what?
Like,
the last
Super
Star Wars game I played was like
Wars.
Rogue Squadron.
Yeah.
On the Super Nintendo, there was like Super Star Wars, and then there was
Oh, I have
the
that.
big game on Nintendo 64. Shadow of the Empire on Nintendo 64, and a little bit of the first Battlefield. But that's really it, just like 2 or 3 of the Star Wars games. I haven't been huge into them. So, what about you, YellowKillerBee?
I played a lot of Dark Forces. If you want to talk about old Star Wars game, that was a first-person shooter for PC, like way back in the day. But since then, like, I just really haven't played much on the like Star Wars side.
I just looked up that game. Sorry to interrupted you, but I wanted to say this real quick. The way that it looks reminds me a lot of like Perfect Dark.
I'm googling it now.
Yeah,
Dark Forces.
If it gives you a hint, like it didn't have like mouse look as the default. Like that's how old it was. So you had to like, you were supposed to control it with like the number pad, but you could like change it so that you could do it with the mouse instead.
Yeah, it says it was released in like 95 and 96.
Yeah, so it was a ways back there. But yeah, I haven't really played many Star Wars games since then. And I always kind of viewed it as a one of those more difficult genres or I guess IPs to deal with, because they just struggled so much with all of these different games that really haven't captured the imagination of their fan base. And why not? Well, sometimes it was just because the games themselves weren't that good and the IP wasn't strong enough to like take this kind of struggling game. And again, this is just a kind of a third-party perspective, not having played any of these games myself. But I think once a game kind of gets a stigma like that, then it's really hard to pull it out of that rut. And I wonder, like, for me, if I was thinking, well, do I want a Destiny like Star Wars game, or do I want an Uncharted like Star Wars game? Well, give me the Uncharted one all the way. And but I can understand them wanting to appeal to the masses just because of all the trouble they've had doing that in the past.
Yeah, and the big thing about this game is it wasn't like what was it? Like 5-6 years ago, there was another Star Wars game that they were working on. It was supposed to be literally the same exact thing, where it was a big open, I don't know if it was open world, but an open adventure, action-oriented game that was supposed to tell this really awesome story. For the time, it had really impressive graphics. I think it was being called Star Wars 1313. Do you know what I'm talking about, Daniel? Or was it Star Wars 3131?
I don't know.
Right.
I'm so sorry.
Well, it went into development for like 3-4 years, maybe a little bit longer. It got canceled. And there wasn't this single-player adventure Uncharted-like game that was coming for Star Wars. And then they announced that they were making this other Star Wars game with a lot of people who have experience, not just with making games, but with making the game that everybody wanted. Because when Star Wars Battlefront came out, everybody was like, well, it's an awesome multiplayer game, but where's the story? And because of that, they put a one-player story in Battlefront 2, but then they also had this other game that they were working on. It was supposed to come out in 2019. The game, like, it wasn't bad. There wasn't a lot of bugs or glitches. No one has mentioned that they were behind on schedule or the game was shaping up to not be good. It was just they didn't want that type of game anymore. And so now they're starting from the ground up, and it'll be yet another 4 or 5 years before the game will likely come out. And that's if it doesn't get canceled again, because at that time maybe another genre is suddenly really popular. But because of like Dota, Overwatch, and all these games, they want to make that style of Star Wars game. Which is a bit odd to me, because I feel like Star Wars 2 is already kind of close to Destiny. Or Battlefront 2 is already close to Destiny. I don't know. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, it seems like they're kind of like shrinking in the diversity of the franchise a bit. But like, I don't know if that could be fine, because like KillerBee said, there's a bit of an identity crisis in those Star Wars games. You've got like platformers, you've got like shooters, you've got adventure games, you've got flying on rail games. You know, you've got this whole plethora of all these different genres, and there's no real like consistency between them. So yeah, I don't know. If you want to like kind of bring it together into one niche market of like, these are what the Star Wars games are going to be, that makes kind of sense. But Star Wars is such a huge property right now, like as a franchise, it's not struggling in any way. So
well, and it's interesting to think of like Disney as the holder of that property doing such a good job like on the film end of things. Like, I was actually really happy when Disney bought Star Wars, because I'm like, they might not make the best movies in the world, but they're not going to mess it up either. Like, we're going to get some decent, well thought out, well produced movies out of this, and I'm happy about that. But then on the game side, I almost feel the complete opposite about Disney as the property holder, because I just don't feel like Disney has produced a whole lot of quality games. Like, all these movie IP games are always just kind of very lackluster. And I mean, this is coming from someone who plays a lot of Disney games, but those were all games that were released for the Nintendo, the Genesis, the Super Nintendo a long, long time ago, when they actually made like difficult platformers based on Disney IPs for some reason. Like, it doesn't make any sense, but that was the reality. And now, like, ever since Epic Mickey came out for the Wii, like, they just I cannot think of like any Disney properties that have released like really good games,
unless you count Kingdom Hearts, but that's only like
right, that's like half Disney, and half, exactly. Final Fantasy. had a big.
That's why it's
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Had a big part to play in that, and so yeah, I'm sure there's some exception that I'm totally missing because I'm not saying I have the whole Disney catalog in my head of what's come out, but it's just that perception of, you know, I don't really know that I can trust Disney to produce good games with their IPs, and I don't know that Star Wars is really any exception to that.
Well, it makes me...
LucasArts had it down, I think, but it was when they shut down LucasArts Studios that the Star Wars games kind of took a hit.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think of two things. One was they're canceling the Star Wars games. Again, a lot of people think to make a Star Wars games where they can put in loot boxes and everything, which I'll get into in a second. But it reminds me of Disney Infinity, because for a while that was their big Disney game. Like every Disney property they had, they were putting into Disney Infinity. And it was also a way for them to make money after someone had bought the original game, because you could go buy the toys, which was essentially amiibo that would give you different characters and different worlds to play in. And it reminds me of that, because this would have been a game that probably would have only had 1 or 2 DLC packs, and then that would have been it, to where they're changing it. And this is what goes back to a story that we had last week, which was a lot of the games coming out this year are filled with loot crates. Like even some games that didn't have it in the game before it, like what was it? Shadow of Mordor was the first game that didn't really have any loot boxes or anything. But now, because of Destiny and Overwatch and the success of the loot boxes and stuff that you can buy in those games, now Shadow of War has these loot box like stuff, and that's the type of game that they canceled this Star Wars game to turn it into. And it makes me wonder what your thoughts on these loot boxes are, because it's like you're not guaranteed to get something that you're paying for. You could get something that you already have, or you could get lucky and get something really rare. So what are your thoughts on this?
I haven't played a lot of games with loot boxes in them except for Borderlands. I don't even know if the original had loot boxes, but the second one definitely did. And
yeah, the first one didn't.
I'm still getting like tweets from them where they're like, "Here's 5 free codes. We know you haven't played this game in 2 years, but come back and open these loot boxes." And it's like,
please,
yeah, please. And I'm just like, it's not enough to like pull me in. I guess I did open loot boxes when I was playing it, but I never paid for any. But I just don't know that I'm the typical person that plays those type of games, because it must be working, right? Like from a standpoint of marketing and sales and keeping your company alive to make more games, like it must be working if all these games are putting it in. But I think the danger is how much is too much. When are people going to get really sick of having loot boxes in every game that they're playing next year?
Yeah, like the last week, Daniel and I ended up settling on it's fine that they have it. We don't necessarily play those types of games, so it doesn't really affect us. And I don't want to say, oh, loot boxes are evil, they shouldn't be in games. There are a lot of people that are getting really angry and saying that. But loot boxes to me is like, they're there for the people who want them. The people who don't want them don't have to do it. It was the same argument that I had with the Breath of the Wild DLC. When everybody was angry about it, I was like, well, for me, it's just more Zelda. They could have just ended the game and started working on something else, or they could give you something extra as a thank you for purchasing the game, so they're working on the DLC. So it's there for the people who want it. If you're angry about it, then just, you don't have to buy it, is the thing. So, that
was the conclusion we settled on a number of things last week. I'm ready games on Switch. Well, if you don't want it, don't buy it.
Yeah, there was a similar story where Nintendo was making a priority of going to other developers and asking for mature and lewd type games. Like Doom, which is like a really mature game with a lot of shooting, but then the other side of it where it's like the anime-styled, almost hentai-like games. Nintendo was going to developers, well, I think the name of the game was like Galgun 2, and not just being like, hey, if you want to put this game on here, bring it over, but they're going to these developers basically saying, please please bring this game over. Not just saying, hey, if you want to, you can. They're literally going out asking all the different developers for these games. And we decided on it's good because you do get games like Doom and some of these others, and if you don't like mature games, then you don't have to buy it. That was my thought on the loot boxes, because before it didn't really affect me, but now it's like, well, is there a game in production now that I'm looking forward to? Like, what if the next Zelda game, or I don't think Nintendo would do anything like this, but for the case with the Star Wars game, someone who was really looking forward to that game that may not have been interested in loot boxes, and they were being kind of positive about it like we were, to where it's like, well, it doesn't affect me. The people who want it has it, but the people who don't want it doesn't get it. It doesn't really affect you if you don't want it to, but now loot boxes are causing games to just get canceled because they're not in them. So now I think it has gone a bit too far, to where it's like, why not? Like, the game was already over halfway finished. It was supposed to come out in 2 years. It was already in development for like 3 years. Why not just release that game and then design the next game with this in mind, instead of just like throwing all the money and time spent on that game away, costing all of the people their jobs, and then giving the game to another person to work on just because you want these loot boxes in it that may not actually work. Like, the game could implement them horribly and people just like buy the game, and then you don't really make that much on the loot boxes. So yeah, that was basically my thoughts, is like, I think it's getting a bit too far when games are being canceled because of it.
Yeah,
I can't help but think that there's always like more going on behind the scenes, just because like you said, there's, throwing away all that money that they spent on the game development. Like, are they really thinking they're going to make that much back when they do all the math? I think they just when you have so many companies working together, the developers and the publishers and the people making the game, and I mean, I'm sure it's just like this tangle of trying to figure out what's going on and what's the best route. And I feel bad for anyone that their game got cut. Sorry if you were looking forward to Star Wars Uncharted. It sounded fun.
Yeah.
The videos on this channel are funded by supporters on Patreon like you. If you're a fan of this channel and would like to join on videos, receive shoutouts, watch videos early, have your questions answered, or have your topic discussed on our podcast, please consider supporting on Patreon for these and many other rewards for just $1. Shoutouts for this video includes Link Use the Triforce, Rusty Caulfield, Lovable Christie, Give Time 15, Shadow to Us, Robbie Morgan, and Lunarium. I want to thank all of you for everything you have done to help support this channel.